There are people who become famous slowly, inch by inch, through calculated moves and deliberate positioning. And then there are people who stumble into the spotlight, almost by accident, only to discover that fame is far heavier than it looks from the outside. Austin Lee Russell, the man the world came to know simply as Chumlee, belongs firmly in the second category. His story did not begin with ambition or a carefully laid plan. It began with a friendship, a willingness to sweep floors, and an unpolished personality that somehow, against every expectation, made millions of people feel like they were watching someone real. But behind that wide grin and laid-back demeanor was a life that was quietly unraveling, and when everything finally came crashing down in the spring of 2016, it was not just headlines that changed. It was the entire trajectory of who he was and what he would become. To understand what happened to Chumlee, you have to go back further than the television cameras, further than the pawn shop, further than the nickname itself. You have to go back to a household in Henderson, Nevada, where 6 people shared a modest life in the shadow of one of the most extravagant cities on Earth. Las Vegas glittered just a few miles away, but inside that house, things were practical. His father spun records as a DJ, his mother worked casino floors, and the children learned early that comfort was something you earned through effort, not something that arrived on its own. That kind of upbringing either breaks a person or it builds something durable in them. For Austin Russell, it built a capacity for hard work that would later define his career, even if few people could see it beneath the jokes and the casual television persona. By the time he was 12 years old, a friend's father had already given him the name that would outlast nearly everything else in his life. The comparison to Chumlee, the lovable walrus from an old animated series, was meant as a joke, the kind of offhand comment adults make without thinking twice. But nicknames have a way of becoming truth when enough people repeat them, and this one stuck in a way that eventually transcended the original joke entirely. Years later, Chumlee would be a brand, a merchandise empire, a television character, and a cautionary tale, all at once. His path to the gold and silver pawn shop came through friendship, not ambition. He had grown up alongside Corey Harrison, whose family owned the business, and as their bond deepened over the years, it became natural for Chumlee to spend more time around the shop. He did not walk through those doors with expertise or credentials. He arrived as someone willing to do what needed doing, starting out cleaning and sorting, and learning the rhythms of a business built on the constant churn of other people's possessions. For 5 years before a camera ever entered that building, he was quietly absorbing knowledge, developing an instinct for value, particularly in areas that intersected with his personal passions. He could tell you things about vintage arcade machines that most appraisers would have to research. He understood the sneaker market with the depth of a true collector. He had a feel for pop culture memorabilia that came not from study, but from genuine fascination. When the History Channel brought a camera crew into the pawn shop in 2009, the expectation was straightforward. Rick Harrison would anchor the show with his business acumen. His father, the old man, would provide wisdom and eccentricity in equal measure. Corey would represent the younger generation, carrying the family legacy forward. Chumlee was not part of that calculation. He was there to be funny, to stumble occasionally, to give viewers someone to laugh with, and sometimes at. What nobody anticipated was that audiences would see something in him that went beyond the role he had been assigned. There was an authenticity to his responses, a genuineness in his enthusiasm that cut through the constructed reality of television in a way that the more polished personalities on screen could not replicate. People did not just find him entertaining. They connected with him. By 2012, the volume of fan mail arriving for him had ballooned to tens of thousands of letters per month, and when the merchandise numbers were tallied, he was outselling every other face associated with the show. The sidekick had become the most recognizable element of the product. He did not waste that momentum. In 2010, he moved quickly to convert fan affection into a sustainable business, launching a merchandise operation that sold everything from autographed memorabilia to clothing and collectible figures. The response exceeded anything a reasonable person would have projected. Within a year, demand had grown so substantially that he made the kind of decision that reveals a sharper business mind than his on-screen persona suggested. He sold half of his merchandise company to Rick Harrison, accepting $155,000 in exchange for the infrastructure and reach that Rick could provide. Critics might see a man giving away ownership of his own success, but the reality was more strategic. He was buying scale, and the results bore that out. The operation expanded its distribution, its online presence, and its capacity to handle the kind of demand that had outgrown a solo effort. His visibility extended well beyond the pawn shop walls. Television appearances on shows that had nothing to do with antiques or transactions introduced him to audiences who had never watched a single episode of Pawn Stars. He turned up on youth-oriented programming, late-night talk shows, and automotive series, each appearance reinforcing his image as someone who is simply himself regardless of the context. That consistency is rare, and in the entertainment industry, it tends to translate into longevity. But longevity requires more than likability. It requires a private life that can bear scrutiny, or at the very least, one that remains private. For Chumlee, neither would prove to be true. The signs, in retrospect, were there before the fame. In 2008, a year before Pawn Stars aired its first episode, he was picked up by Las Vegas police on a loitering charge connected to a prostitution sting. At the time, it generated no significant attention. He was not yet a public figure, and the incident disappeared into the background noise of a city where similar events happen constantly and rarely carry lasting consequence. But looking back from the vantage point of everything that followed, that moment reads differently. Not as proof of a predetermined outcome, but as an early indication of the gap that existed between the affable public face and the private life running parallel to it. By around 2013, people who knew him well noticed a change. The gregariousness that had made him a natural on television seemed to be receding. He was spending more time alone, more time focused on his personal collections, less time in social environments that had once energized him. Fame, it turns out, is not simply an amplifier of good things. It amplifies pressure too, and criticism, and the relentless feeling of being observed and assessed. For someone whose charm derived largely from unself-consciousness, the growing awareness of being constantly watched was not a comfortable fit. On March 9, 2016, Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department officers arrived at Chumlee's home carrying a search warrant. The warrant had been issued in connection with a sexual assault allegation that had been filed earlier that month. The allegation was serious, the investigation was legitimate, and law enforcement responded with appropriate urgency. What they found inside the house, however, told a story that was entirely separate from the incident they had come to investigate. The assault case itself would later collapse entirely due to insufficient evidence, but the search of the property had already uncovered something far more damaging. Inside the home, officers discovered a substantial quantity of controlled substances. Methamphetamine, marijuana, prescription medication including Xanax, and traces of cocaine were found along with items commonly associated with drug distribution rather than casual personal use, including small plastic bags and a digital scale. For a television personality whose image was built on harmless comedy and working-class authenticity, the discovery was jarring in a way that the public had not been prepared for. But the weapons discovery was, in some ways, even more significant. 12 firearms were found on the premises. Handguns, rifles, and at least one weapon that fell into the assault-style category. Of those 12 guns, only a small number were legally registered to him. The rest represented serious violations of federal and state weapons laws. Many of these items were found locked away in a vault on the ground floor of the property, a vault that Chumlee reportedly hesitated to open when officers requested access. That hesitation, brief as it was, became one of the more memorable details to emerge from the entire episode. A private room in the house, which the press immediately and gleefully labeled the Chum Chum Room, upon learning it featured a dance pole, added an element of tabloid spectacle to what was already a complicated news story. The charges that followed were severe. Multiple felony counts covering drug possession and weapons violations left him facing the theoretical possibility of decades in prison. Prosecutors took the position that his celebrity status elevated rather than diminished the seriousness of the situation, arguing that public figures carry a particular responsibility and that the scale of what was found in the home went beyond anything that could be reasonably framed as private recreational behavior. His legal team countered by emphasizing the absence of any prior criminal record of substance, characterizing the situation as personal rather than predatory, and arguing that the leap from possession to decades of incarceration would be disproportionate for someone with no history of violence or distribution. The courtroom argument never fully played out because Chumlee accepted a plea agreement. He took responsibility for what had been found, avoided the uncertainty and risk of a trial, and accepted the terms that were negotiated on his behalf. The plea carried conditions, including probation and required program participation, that would shape his daily life for years afterward. He would complete those obligations quietly and without further incident, but the legal resolution did not immediately resolve the damage to his public image. For a period, the question hanging over everything was whether the version of Chumlee that had made him beloved was a performance that had now been conclusively unmasked, or whether the real person was complicated in ways that did not cancel out the genuine qualities his audience had responded to for years. At almost exactly the same moment his legal world was collapsing, his physical health had also reached a point that could not be sustained. He was carrying close to 350 pounds, a weight that his physicians had made clear was generating serious long-term health risks. The convergence of legal crisis and health crisis was, in its own terrible way, clarifying. There was nothing left to pretend was fine. Everything required attention simultaneously. He made the decision to pursue gastric sleeve surgery at a bariatric facility in Las Vegas, a procedure that reduces the functional stomach to a fraction of its original size and simultaneously reduces the production of hormones that drive hunger. Is not a simple solution, and medical professionals are consistent in emphasizing that surgery without behavioral change tends not to produce lasting results. Chumlee seemed to understand this. Before the procedure, he had already lost around 35 pounds through changes to his eating habits and increased physical activity, demonstrating a commitment that made the surgery safer and the subsequent results more meaningful. The transformation that followed was dramatic by any measure. Over the course of several years, he shed more than 160 pounds, moving from approximately 350 to somewhere in the range of 190. He has spoken in interviews about the difference in how he felt physically and mentally, describing the experience of inhabiting a body that functioned without the constant strain that had accompanied his previous weight. The health changes were visible and verifiable, and they became part of a broader narrative of reinvention that the public gradually accepted, in part because the evidence of it was undeniable. His personal life was also shifting during this period, though not entirely in the direction of stability. He had met Olivia Rodman in 2013, but it was during the darkest stretch of his legal troubles in early 2016 that their relationship became serious. She was a student with aspirations in photography, and the fact that she remained present during what was objectively the most difficult and publicly humiliating period of his adult life was not something he took lightly. Their relationship deepened through shared pressure, which is one of the more reliable tests of whether something genuine exists between two people. By 2018, he had decided to formalize that commitment. During a trip to Hawaii, he proposed at the Royal Hawaiian Hotel, presenting her with a diamond ring and marking a moment that felt, to those watching from the outside, like the punctuation on a chapter he had been trying to close for 2 years. He opened Chumlee's Candy on the Las Vegas Strip, positioned directly across from the pawn shop, in 2017. The store was pitched specifically at the tourist traffic that flowed through that corridor, and it delivered on its premise. Visitors came for the novelty and the nostalgia, they stayed for the selection, and the reviews reflected a product that understood its audience. It was further evidence that whatever else might be said about him, he possessed a genuine commercial instinct that translated well beyond the television context. But the personal reinvention was not without further complications. By 2020, observers who paid attention to his social media presence began noticing something. The shared photographs with Olivia had stopped appearing. Their mutual following on social platforms remained, but the absence of any documentation of shared life spoke louder than any announcement could have. She eventually deactivated her accounts for a stretch, and he stopped mentioning her entirely in public-facing content. At some point, it became clear to anyone paying attention that the marriage had ended, though neither party made a formal statement to that effect. She returned to school in South Carolina. He remained in Las Vegas focused on his businesses and his ongoing television commitments, and the distance between those two lives made the conclusion obvious without requiring explicit confirmation. He acknowledged in a post that was later removed that the separation had been difficult to navigate, which was perhaps the most honest thing he could have said about it. The professional picture during this same period told a very different story from a personal one. His return to Pawn Stars after the legal resolution had not been the awkward, provisional thing that many predicted. Audiences came back, ratings held, and his role on the show was not diminished in any perceptible way. The redemption arc, if it could be called that without being too cinematic about it, was real, and it was public. He completed his probation requirements, remained free of further legal trouble, and demonstrated through sustained behavior that the changes he had described were genuine rather than performed for public consumption. The franchise expanded to include Pawn Stars Do America, a spin-off that took the core cast across 15 American cities over multiple seasons. The format was demanding, sometimes requiring nearly 3 consecutive weeks on location without return to Las Vegas, and Chumlee embraced it without visible reluctance. The show gave him and his co-stars access to new audiences and new types of items, and it extended the relevance of a franchise that by rights might have exhausted itself after a decade of the original format. His presence in these new environments reinforced what his fans had always believed, that the personality they had been watching for years was not an artifact of a controlled setting, but something that traveled. He pursued projects that had nothing to do with the television world. A video game built around his image and his dog, funded through a crowdfunding campaign, leaned into the retro aesthetic of classic gaming hardware in a way that resonated specifically with the nostalgia-oriented audience that had always been his